Welcome back to the Mental Health Hour on Love Bay Afrobeat Music and Talk Radio. I'm your host, Felicia Fishoff, registered psychotherapist and founder of Rooted in Resilience Psychotherapy and Wellness. Tonight on Real Talk, we're having a conversation about something many women experience, but perhaps don't always feel they have permission to fully grieve. Because most people don't walk into marriage imagining how it might end. We imagine the life we're going to build, the family we may create, the traditions we'll establish, the person we believe will grow old beside. And when a marriage ends, sometimes we're not only grieving the relationship, we may also be grieving the future we imagined, the identity we held within that marriage, the family structure we thought we would have, the routines, friendships, community, financial security, or sense of belonging that may have been built around that life. Tonight's conversation is Divorce Wasn't the Plan: Women, Grief, and Starting Again. And we're going to talk honestly about what happens when the life you planned is no longer the life you're living. We'll explore grief and identity, motherhood and family, loneliness, anger, fear, guilt, and yes, even relief and hope, because those emotions can coexist. You can grieve something and still know that ending it was necessary. You can miss what was and not want it back. You can feel relief and still be heartbroken. And you can be hopeful about your future while still mourning the future you once imagined. Tonight, we're making room for it all. And tonight I'm joined by four incredible women bringing their clinical expertise, professional perspectives, and lived understanding to this conversation. Charlene Lex is a registered psychotherapist, Christian life coach, and faith and mental health expert who supports individuals, couples, and organizations in emotional health, spiritual clarity, and purpose driven living. She is EMDR certified and integrates approaches including IFS, EFT, and attachment based therapy, bridging psychological insight with faith based principles. Welcome back, Charlene. Natasha Pennycook is a multi award winning registered psychotherapist, trauma informed leadership strategist, international speaker, and founder and clinical director of her psychotherapy and consulting practice. With more than 15 years of experience, she supports high performing professionals and organizations navigating trauma, burnout, leadership challenges, and racialized workplace experiences. Welcome back, Natasha. Shanique Victoria Edwards is a psychotherapist, mental health consultant, equity speaker, and knowledge translation specialist whose work centers culturally responsive and healing focused approaches to mental wellness. With a background in neuroscience, psychology, and clinical counseling, she integrates trauma informed practice, Afrocentric frameworks, and cultural and spiritual wisdom into her work. Shanique serves the Newmarket African Canadian Association, the Canadian Black Nurses Alliance, and so much more. Ciao, welcome back. And last but of course, Ciao. And last but not least, we're going to welcome back Anansa Leslie Bailey, who is a registered psychotherapist, couples therapist, and the founder and clinical director of I Do Therapy. She specializes in wedding and relationship mental health, supporting couples through engagement, wedding planning, and marriage with a focus on emotional safety, intentionality, and strong communication. Her work focuses on breaking generational cycles, strengthening family foundations, and supporting couples beyond the wedding day. And welcome back, girl. If I don't know if y'all remember that really spicy Valentine's Day episode. Yeah, that was an answer.
Yes,
But
thank you.
before we continue, of course, girl, So before we continue, just a quick reminder, family, that while we are mental health professionals, this show is for educational and community conversational purposes only. It is not, and I repeat, not a substitute for therapy, diagnosis, legal advice, or crisis support. And because tonight's conversation may touch on relationship loss, family challenges, trauma, and other difficult experiences, we encourage you to take care of yourself as you listen. If something comes up for you tonight, reach out to a licensed mental health professional or your local crisis supports if needed. And as we move into tonight's conversation, Love Bay, we want to hear from you. Maybe you've been through a divorce. Maybe you're currently navigating one. Maybe you're contemplating whether your marriage can continue. Or maybe you supported someone you love through the end of a marriage. So here are some questions I'm going to throw out at you, Love Bay. What surprised you most about the grief of divorce? What did you have to rediscover about yourself afterwards? And what do you wish someone had told you about starting again? Share your thoughts in the comments, send us a message, or call into the show at 437-778-3299. There is no single way to grieve a marriage, and there is no single timeline for rebuilding your life afterward. All right, ladies, let's get into it. Welcome back.
What a conversation for tonight.
Oh my God, right? We already dropping the dumpling just by the title, but that's all right. Eh? Well, let's really get into it tonight because I know that this is going to be a topic that we could literally do a series on because it is so deep, right? So the title is, again, Divorce Wasn't the Plan. Women, Grief, and Starting Again. So as usual, I'm going to ask, why do we need to be talking about this topic tonight?
Okay, I'll jump in. Hi,
Yes.
everyone.
Hey,
So nice to be here
Natasha
again.
girl.
Oh gosh, you know what? This topic, it's timely because not only am I hearing this topic come up in with clients, but also with friends, right?
Yes.
It is something that a lot of people are going through. It's something that is bringing a lot of confusion. It wasn't part of the plan, and people are struggling, and there is grief, and I think that's the important thing too, right? Yes, there's sadness, there's anger, but there's also grief of starting again, of starting anew, of plans at not being maintained or not being sustained. So it is important that we're having this conversation so that not only are we here talking about it, but we're putting it out there for people to say, yeah, okay, I'm feeling this way. And I don't have to just keep it hush hush because it's the taboo and getting divorced and all that, but let's put it out there and have this conversation. So love it. Love this topic.
100.
And I would agree too that a part of it is given today's just, boiling it down to the economy. Essentially, it's hard, the idea of starting over, because there's a lot of risk components to it. You may not necessarily be able to do that kind of clean pack up and go thing, right? There's a lot of differences in how divorce is looking or how separation is looking for many folks nowadays, because for some we still have to live together, for some still have to try to figure out how we coexist while I'm grieving, right? This is not sometimes I can just have my own space and kind of focus on what I need to do because I'm still intermingled with this individual, or I'm still tied up in a house, or I'm still like, there's still so many ties that can cause the grief to keep on coming back up, even if you feel like you have dealt with segments of it along the way.
100%.
And I was saying, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just saying that I think that there's grief in loss too, because people who you thought were family, all of a sudden people are now choosing sides. And so there's grief in realizing that you spent 20, 30, 40 years, right, building relationships with people. And all of a sudden you're not seeing those people anymore or engaging with them in the same ways anymore, right? And so I think that the grief is so compounded, and it's almost like over time you find more and more aspects of the grief.
Absolutely. And just to add on to another layer here, I think people are at the point of deciding on what it is they would prefer to grieve. So, are they going to be grieving the relationship, or are they going to grieve the future that they want for themselves? And I think at that point, they're ready to say, you know what, I'm going to choose myself and have the life that I've always desired. And of course, several things can be true at the same time. You can grieve, but also live your life at the same time, right? So there's that ambivalence that's happening.
Woo, ladies. Yes. Okay, let's go. You know, everything that you guys mentioned is spot on. Especially noticed after the pandemic that there was a huge increase of, at least what I've known, maybe it's just my age group, but I noticed a lot of divorces happen post pandemic. Like people were, I guess people were in each other's faces, and it was just too many elbows that people are like, nope, we're done. Obviously it's a lot more complex than that, but I noticed that there was a lot of divorces that was happening. And I don't think that, like you guys mentioned, that we talk about the grief and the loss that is accompanied with a divorce, right? Like when we think about grief, we think about a death loss, right? And we don't necessarily think about the different life transitions that people go through, right? And I think that when we think about divorce, we don't really think about the different things that you actually grieve when a relationship ends. So why don't we just start off there, right? So what are the different things that women may grieve after a relationship ends?
I think about the time, because I think especially for women, you know when the relationship is over, maybe before you even get to that road, right? Like, and for some, it may have been I've known for a long time, like I knew for years, right? And so I think even the layers of grief may even start with the fact that, like, perhaps you had to stay in it or you chose to stay in it for longer, even though you knew that it was over. There's a grief of time lost, right? Like I didn't actually get to do my start over. Maybe I was ready and I didn't even get to do that. And this lost time, depending on what was happening, I think sometimes, even starting from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I also think that it's the grief of the story and the dream. This is married. This is what we had dreamed about. This is the life that we wanted to have. And all of a sudden, you're looking at all of the things that didn't happen the way that you had dreamt that it would happen. And as long as you stayed in the relationship, there's always that little bit of hope that maybe you can get there, right? Maybe this can still happen. But then at the end, it's just that realization it never happened, right? The person that I was with never actually actualized into this person who I thought that he could be or she could be, we could be together, right? There's such a deep grief there.
And also, I think at times you might be grieving the village that you know, were able to receive at the time of the marriage. So, you weren't raised in a household that had a lot of family members, and you married into, a family that embraced you. And now that you're divorcing, you feel like those ties are going to be severed. That is another layer of grief. You go somewhere for Christmas, you went for the holidays, you went for Thanksgiving. Where do you go now if you're not in that relationship anymore? And very difficult to process.
And then there's the grief of, being able to grow old and see your children and children grow up, right? I mean, that possibility obviously is still there, but separate, not being able to do it together. That's something that I'm noticing too, that individuals are saying, like, well, we had this idea that we would do this and do that and see our children and grandchildren, but that story, that legacy, that piece that they've been building together as they're starting to divorce and going through the process, that changes as well. So there's a lot of grief there associated with that.
Absolutely. And I think also, even jumping on that, Natasha, is that separation for your kids, like grieving that as well, right? That impact that it has on your children, is also definitely something that people grieve and stress about, and panic and feel anxiety about. And I also love, Shanique, he talked about the time, right? And I think it's also some people may feel like, oh, was that a waste of time? Did I waste the time being in this relationship, and have a grief over that of what could have been? So I think that there's also like different layers and aspects of that timepiece as well.
I think one of the things too that I would flag, it's interesting, that even within that grief, you mentioned anxiety, and I think, sometimes we do think about divorce in terms of that clean cut, but how about when it's not clean cut and you have to think about potentially co-parenting and the fact that it might be difficult and the hard time that your partner may or may not give you, like all of that, anticipatory anxiety that gets welled up within the fact that we never needed to be here, or this is not where I thought we were going to be, I think also couples into these multiple layers of grief.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. And even just jumping back into that, I think that, based on even just some of my own work with clients, I think that there is also, a grief in terms of just being a woman in general, and a lot of, like, we do motherhood. Obviously, we sacrifice a lot in our relationships as women, right? We take time off work. Some women sacrifice their careers, and then, okay, now the marriage ends, and for some, it feels like they're starting over, right? And that comes with grief, and it also comes with fear, and there's just a whole bag of emotions that is layered and complex in the midst of all of that.
Mhm. Mhm. And I wonder about that starting over piece, right? I think sometimes it can be so glamorized at times, like I see on social media, the divorce papers and, all of that. But, the building blocks of starting over are real. Like, what if, for example, based on the distribution of the relationship, now I might have to go out and find work. Maybe I'll have to, reconsider what it's like in terms of being able to show up at all the kids' things because other responsibilities make it so that, I can't be that parent who is at everything because things have shifted, or even down to, taking on the brunt of the caregiving role too, right? Because of the difference in the distribution. And so I think those building blocks of like starting over sometimes can be really, as much as you're grieving, can really kind of be laced with their own kind of emotional cocktail as well.
I
Mm-hmm.
love that you brought that point up too about the social media piece, because there's another layer of potentially shame and embarrassment that might come with leaving and divorcing.
Yeah.
You know, that's why sometimes people don't want to post pictures of their spouse on social media. Okay. Because now you're breaking up in front of every single person and you're wondering, well, what is everybody going to say? How do I inform the family? How do I express this to people? What are they going to be feeling and saying about me? Right.
Mhm.
So that can add another layer to things that makes it a little bit more complex for people to go through this process.
Absolutely. I know that Facebook isn't as trendy as it used to be back in our day,
Oh no,
but remember the status changes?
it's coming back.
Like,
And people took them seriously. Like status changes were a serious thing.
Yeah.
Right?
when it says it's complicated, and you're like,
Complicated.
it's
What
complicated.
happened?
For those of you who had to do the it's complicated status, it's all right. We're with you. We're with you.
You got weird questions. People texting you like, "Hey, what's going on?" And then you got to explain.
God. Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
the thing with social media, right? It opens up, even if you are just maybe posting because you like it, or you're posting because you want to share with family abroad, it opens you up to like so much, especially at a time where you may ultimately be so vulnerable as well, right? Like there's so many moving parts, even just down to like filing and serving and going through that process, and does one agree, does one not agree, like it can, and even down to the length of time for the divorce, like it's sometimes it's not as cookie cutter. Some people I know have been going through divorces for 5 years, like that's a significant amount of time of your life where people are oh, what's going on, oh, what's happening, are you guys divorced yet? Like I can just imagine the cringe of that question every time.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
The other
Absolutely.
thing that pops up in my mind too, when I think about some of these social media couples that have gone through a divorce, um, it's the blame of the party as to why they're getting divorced. They're trying to point fingers and saying, "Well, you're responsible for doing this," and other people are not in your relationship. So that adds another layer of some of the stressors that you may be going through, on top of trying to, if you have kids, and console the children and figuring out your family. You're focused on what everyone else in the world is saying about you, and now you're taking on that, and it's just, yeah, it's unfortunate.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I think right now we're talking about the glamorized way of splitting up. It can get really dirty and messy, and that in itself brings grief, distress, and trauma, right? Because here's this someone that you love, and then it is just gloves off. It can get really like messy legally, and there's a lot that actually gets thrown into the game sometimes when it comes to splitting up, right? Who owns what, who did what, who said versus, she said versus he said or they said, right? It's just, yeah, wild.
Mhm.
I want to add too, for the social media piece, a lot of times online, which is like 5% of someone's reality, and we're
Yeah.
focusing a lot of times our 100%. But what we're seeing online is like couples look perfect, right? There's this
Mhm.
perfection look and this like really nice and pristine look. So
Mm,
when that breakup, when the separation, when the divorce is occurring or going through the process, people get so confused and they're like, "But this is not what I've seen. What are you talking about? You guys look perfect." But the
mhm,
reality is you're only being shown 5% of someone's reality. And I
Mhm.
think that confusion, the kind of social confusion, then when it goes back into the couples, it's like, well, are we doing the right thing? Are we questioning what's going on? Or, it's a, well, we're trying to figure things out while the world is saying, no, no, you shouldn't be doing these things. And it does, it creates that confusion, creates a shame. It creates all that, also that mistrust, right?
Mhm.
mhm,
In like families and friends, but also the mistrust in, were they being able to be authentic in what's going on in their relationship? We hear so much about, living your authentic life, but how
yeah.
much of that can you actually put out there so that you're safe within your relationship? There's so
Mhm,
many various layers here that we're seeing play out on social media, but also in the therapy room. So, like when we're looking at that grief, there are various levels of the grief that is taking place, and being able to equip individuals and women with all of this information so that they're not blindsided.
Mhm.
mhm,
Well said.
Yeah.
mhm,
And it's one thing when you're ready, like to leave, but the kids are still grieving
Mhm.
the family unit, the parent, right? And so it's like, on one hand, you've done your work, you're ready to go, you're ready to live your life, to be authentic and all of those things. But then you still have to hold space for your kids as they're then going through the grief process for themselves, because they actually didn't know. They might have heard or seen mom and dad arguing and all of that, but they actually didn't realize that it's gotten to that point, right? And so then you're probably having to like juggle also, what is the partner saying that the kids are hearing, what are other family members saying that the kids are hearing. So then you're holding all of these different moving parts, and it's so overwhelming, it's so stressful, right? And so it's not just what are you going through as you're divorcing and all of the emotions that come with it. It's all of the other parts of it too, with the extended family.
What do you
mhm,
think about, what if, you put in, any other forms of trauma or betrayal, right? Because with that comes, at times, depending on, for example, let's just say maybe if there's infidelity or something along those lines, it compromises more than just the family unit, right? We said about, the future and what you imagined in terms of this individual, but it also, at depending on the level of the issue, it can also, grieve yourself, because there's a sense of self that gets brought into this as well, when you're thinking about these different components of this. And so it's like, oh, well, who am I after this? Like, I've attached who I am to being this person's, partner. Who am I without that? So starting over is not just, the basic building blocks of where we're going to live and, financially, but also, who am I when I, if you took the person's last name, when I drop the last name, who am I when I take off that ring? Who am I when I'm no longer this person's wife? Right. It's, and it doesn't really matter if it was like 2 days or if it was 20 years, right? At some point in time, your identity was attached and involved with this person, and you're having to reintroduce yourself to yourself as you're trying to, also, you know, shift with other people's perception of who you are when you're no longer this person's wife.
Mhm. Mhm. Why don't we lean into that identity piece, because that identity piece is so huge when a relationship ends, right? And with that, there's a lot of different emotions that women carry, as they're navigating who am I and those questions, right? One is, okay, well, I've held this identity for so long, right? If I let it go, is there going to be shame, embarrassment? What are people going to say and think?
Mhm. And also, like, it was your identity. You made a choice to be with this person. You made a choice to, be aligned and to be able to, take on this partnership and this union and everything that that meant. And so, depending again on the what led to the divorce, you can almost feel like you were robbed of that. Right. And so, especially when it's something that you did not choose, right? And you also at times don't get the ability to navigate the other person's narration of ultimately what happened as well. So as you're trying to unpack who you are, also juggling that with, is this person actually also, putting out a positive or, a similar narration of this same thing that we're both trying to navigate?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I like to support, my clients in looking at themselves as if they were butterflies, right? They're in that transition period. And we do an activity where, I have them draw themselves as the butterfly. Their left wing, we're analyzing what they're releasing. So they're asking their questions about, what am I carrying from this relationship? What is the beliefs that I had about this breakup and what we're challenging about it? Your center is, who am I now? And that can be a little bit more complex to identify. So you're wondering, well, who am I outside of this relationship? What are some components in terms of my values that I need to lean in? Because what happens when you do get into a marriage, you tend to merge those values and become one, or you may end up shifting them to mold into the person that you were with. So now let's remove that mold and focus on yourself. And then the right wing is, who am I becoming? Right? You want to envision that future for yourself. You want to ask those questions about, where do I align the most? Where do I see myself in the next, in the next day? It doesn't even have to be, 5 years from now. Where do I see myself in the next hour? So just taking it step by step in terms of this entire process and transition, because a butterfly, it doesn't take in one day for them to flourish, right? It's a process. So we're going to ensure that we go through that together.
Ooh, that is so beautiful, Anansi. I love that. I might just steal that. Just
Go
saying.
ahead. Talk about activity now.
Yes, child. Yes, child. As you were sharing that, I was thinking about, how in some relationships, right? And we see it in couples work where some couples are what we call like differentiated really well, where they both have their own separate lives, even though they're together as a couple. And then there are some, as we know, that are enmeshed, that
Mm.
you don't know one from the next. would you say to those listening that may be going through a divorce, but they were in enmeshed and they're struggling to find who they are again because they don't know themselves differently from their partner?
Mhm. Take your time. I think sometimes, when we're trying to navigate different forms of trauma, and I actually think divorce is a trauma, to be honest. I think the rupture that comes, even if it was a very copacetic, agreed upon transition or a conscious uncoupling, whatever we want to call it, I still think that that rupture is significant, that it has, trauma threads, even if you won't want to call it a trauma wound. And I think that takes time because, depending, especially how long you may have been married and enmeshed with that person, so much of a certain part of your life period may be attached to that, right? If you think about somebody who got married maybe young in their 20s, they're divorcing now in their 50s, that's a huge chunk of your life that was attached to another person. So to think that within a year or 2 years, somehow I'm going to know who I am completely, I'm totally going to be this new right wing part of my butterfly, I don't think that's a realistic expectation. I think sometimes we feel that pressure to do that, especially when we put, certain things like social media or family pressures or even the idea of getting back into dating or whatnot into the loop of different things. But I think, one of the gifts you can provide yourself is once you've, transitioned out of that is time to explore what that might look like for yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you're doing that healing work for yourself, one of the things that I like to help my clients to do is to actually like go back and do forgiveness work with the part of them that chose that partner, right?
Mhm.
And really helping them to recognize that they're not her anymore, right? They've done their own work, they've gone through their own growth process, and the person who they are today could make that choice. That's a different choice, in a lot of times, a better choice for themselves, for their kids, for their family, right? But it is about really holding space for that version of themselves that said yes to a relationship that was good at the time, but they're not her anymore.
And I would add also, how do you then, especially within enmeshed relationships, how do you start to form community again outside of that couple dynamic, right? Being able to use the time, use the forgiveness, and to say, okay, what are the parts of me that do want to connect? And how have maybe those parts been neglected over the last number of years? And how do they build community again? What does that look like? So it's that opportunity to allow that individual in the present to make the decisions on who they want to become, right? Because a lot of time, especially with enmeshment, those ideas or thoughts or those identity pieces were not only put on the back burner, they're like off the stove altogether, right? So how do we put them back on the stove and work their way, help them to work their way to the front? I think that's an important piece as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
also to
even as you, oh, go ahead, girl, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think also to add to that too, because usually when somebody is enmeshed, they tend to, you know, remove themselves from other relationships, their friendships, and it doesn't mean that they purposely just or maybe consciously very aware of that. It just naturally happens. So it would be great to revisit past relationships that really meant something to you if, you guys haven't been able to spend time together. So it's okay to reach out to, those friends who you may not have seen often. Um, I'm here. I want to check in and rebuild because you do need your village. You do need friendships to move through a breakup. It could be very a lonely process and it could be intense. So having those relationships with you, it's
Hmm. And even just to that, like I know that there's, every relationship is different, but I do know that for some women, they were actually pressured to not speak with some of their friends and
yeah,
family.
yeah.
And so even that idea of repair with, friends and family, if it's repairable at that point, because sometimes some women are pressured to cut people off, and they become really isolated. And so that takes a lot of work as well. And just to also jump back into what you were saying, Natasha, right, about how do we um, lean in on support, how do we find that part of ourselves again? I think really tapping into our inner child is really important, right? Because when we can really look at that little girl on the inside, she still has like things that she loves to do. She's still creative, she's still playful, she's still, even if we can't see her yet, she is definitely still there. So, you know, little shameless plug, going to a therapist, bringing us, clearly we're not as scary as it seems, right? Uh, going to, and we're all therapists. So, hey, just, if you're in Ontario, we're all therapists. Hey, hey. But yeah, no, finding a therapist to even do some of that work, to really tap into who that little girl is, what are her dreams, what are her aspirations, and really helping her to find that part of herself again.
And I think that point that was brought up by one of our viewers there in the chat around, when the community is centered around church, right? And I think especially for us, you know, um, you know, when I think that's such a hard thing because church, depending on, your faith journey, your faith walk, can be so
Yes.
integral to every element of your family unit. Kids go to youth group, has maybe a deacon or, an usher, you yourself, so involved. And then, what does that look like? Right. And in terms of that starting over piece, having to work through, those elements, especially with something that is also perhaps maybe a vehicle for your own healing also.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think
Absolutely.
it's also an opportunity sometimes, and just speaking from like church communities, depending on the church community, it could also be a source of hurt and church hurt, right?
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we need to be able to hold space for some people's experience going through a divorce when they are so active in church, and then the church members have enough to say as they're whispering and things like that. That can cause so much pain, right? And so then that pounds the grief because the community that you would have been able to go towards now becomes another unsafe place. And so that's something else to just kind of like keep at the back of your mind for some people's stories.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I know that, obviously every person's religion is different, but I know that in the church, particularly, there is like a big focus on, marriage and getting married. And there isn't enough focus on singleness. And sometimes there is shame that is attached to being single, whether you are single, never married, or whether you are married and you become divorced, right? And I think that there needs to be more room for singleness and uh, lessen the stigma and the shame that comes with that, right? Because the reality is that some people may want to get married, but they never get married. Some people get married and then they go through that pain. Some people um never get married at all, and that's their choice. They just want to be single forever, and so we have to make room for all of the different variations of it, and talk about it for real, like you know for real. Okay. For real, for real, for real, for real. All right.
It has
About
this opportunity. Go ahead, Shani.
Oh, I was curious. I'm just kind of putting it out there, but I'm wondering about those who maybe the divorce is not finalized ink on paper, but the dynamic within the marriage is essentially
Mhm,
a divorce, right?
mhm,
And I think about operating within the confines of something like that day in and day out. And I mean, I don't really have uh therapeutic lens that has fully developed on that thought, but it was actually coming up in terms of, we oftentimes do think of divorce just, ink to paper, and that's it. But for some folks, we don't know what the story is in terms of their marriage. They may be married, but not necessarily happily. They may be married, but not necessarily cohesive, right?
mhm. That's a good point, girl. Right? I remember a couple years ago, my great uncle, like my husband's uncle, um, he actually shared a story about a couple that they know. And this couple, like, it was so bad that he moved out of the house into the backyard. They had like a little like bunkie in the backyard, and that's where he lived, right?
Oh
They had
Lord.
twins. Oh yeah. They
No, 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 Shar. Come on.
had,
No.
right? They
Uh-uh.
had two boys, and literally, like, they lived like that for 20 years raising those boys.
Wow.
Boys
Wow.
left and then went to university and came back home, and that was still the dynamic, right?
Wow.
And so this is the thing, because I remember him saying, why did they, why did they even like bother staying together if this was going to be the dynamic? And I remember just sitting there and listening to him and thinking, I actually don't know, right? But it sounds painful,
Yes.
Yeah.
right? And
It's
how many people are actually doing these in-home, in-yard separations, right? And actively living like they're divorced, even though there's no paper that you like write on it and say nothing, right?
Mm.
it speaks
Yeah,
to
and that
shame.
is more common than people
I was
realize.
Yes, it's more common than people
Women, on with
realize,
it. On
and
with
it
it. Yes.
speaks to the shame, right? That there is more shame having that paperwork signed than living in the backyard in a
Yes.
shed.
Yes.
We shouldn't be laughing at people's
I
experience.
know, no, but
I was
but
visualizing this poor man,
yes, yeah,
pre-World War II bunkie outside. Like,
and for 20 years.
years.
20 years, that's a long time.
Listen, there's some level of comfort, okay, that he experienced there, because to do that for 20 years,
Mm.
But
there's
is it comfort? I want to throw that out. Is it comfort or
Comfort.
is it, I don't know, something else?
it's definitely something else. It's definitely something else. But to be in that situation continuously for 20 years, I think he's more comfortable out there than being inside the home. That's how
Yes,
you can see how
correct.
there's so much discomfort in that house.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
dysfunction happening in that house.
Absolutely.
That living in the backyard bunkie shed, I'm thinking
Mhm.
outhouse, but like
Yeah.
that is more comfortable than being in the dynamic of whatever is happening in the household. And I
Yeah.
think that it speaks to a real piece that is happening, right?
Yeah.
And Felicia, you alluded to this, that is probably more common
Mhm.
than not, especially within faith-based communities, especially within Caribbean, African communities, where there's so much stigma
Mm.
against getting divorced. And they're so like, well, at least you're married, you're together. It's okay if it doesn't work out or it's not happy, but at least you're together. Like we have to start changing those narratives because there's such harm in that narrative.
Yeah.
Right? That we're staying together, take care of the kids, at least no, like what's actually going on? How is that really impacting a person's sense of self, sense of identity, their own psyche, right? To be able to say, no, I'm happier here, but I'm not here. And what's happening? I think probably in Charlene, your great uncle's case, knowing that person is happier in the bunkie outside than what we all know individuals who are still living in the house
Mhm.
unhappily.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I always wonder, like what after you told me that story, I always wondered, like, what was it like to be the couple friends who knows that this is going on, right? And so you all still get together and you have dinner together, but you know that there's this dynamic. What is it like for that couple who's just sitting there and just like, oh yeah, right? It has to feel uncomfortable for the community too.
100%. And you know that we know how to save face.
Mhm.
And
Yes.
and that impacts adult children too, or the teens. You think it's not impact? You think that they didn't see dad out in the bunker and wonder why? Granduncle, bless you, granduncle. But hey, and it's in it, like it's more common than we realize.
Mm.
Or even kids feel like they have to play along, or it's
Yeah.
gonna cause issues and rock the boat, and that impacts them as well.
And the impact of the silence, right? Like our community is plagued by that. Even when we think about kids, I know when my parents were separating, there was no this, what we see on TV, sit down, have a conversation, and just so you know, this is where the family is going, and, let us know if you need any support. That was not the question. Dad was just not here, and mom was upset, and everybody just left it alone. Nobody talked about anything, right? And I think, that also adds to, the complexity of all of the feelings and the emotions, because you can just imagine for kids, not wanting to burden the parents, knowing what the parents might be going through, but at the same time, not really knowing where to put the bigness of the feelings that they may have, or even have any language towards it, and then also the what is communicated in our culture, kind of like what Natasha was saying, because I can, kind of go back to, and as a fly on the wall of some of the conversations between some of the elders, and well, you just must, and you just, and you got to be so and so, and and I just think about how much of a shell of a person you begin to become as a result of things like that. So, the dynamics of this all are so compounding. And when you don't, and it's not to say you have to, share all the business with the kids. Some things need to be left with the adults, right? But I think sometimes when certain things are not shared, you just have to guess. And I'm just being transparent. Like when my parents broke up and dad just wasn't there, I could only start to allude to, well, was it something that I did? I didn't keep my stuff clean enough. I didn't do this. I didn't do that. And the more that silence perpetuated, it does, impact the relationship with one or both of the parents, because there's so much unknown there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even just going to the chat, yes, Jen, kids see and feel more than we give them credit for, too. Absolutely. Kids are smarter than we give them credit for.
Yes.
They're real smart, real smart. And they get smarter with each generation, right? So, yes, they can pick things up, and they can pick up the verbal and the nonverbal cues, right, between parents. And there's another question here. Would it impact the kids' future relationships?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think depending on how the parents handle the situation with informing the kids, it can either leave them questioning themselves, and even feeling a little bit responsible, just like what she was expressing earlier, where you start to blame yourself and think, hey, I'm the reason why that I'm separating. So if you're starting to blame yourself, you're internalizing that, and then it's starting to ruminate as shame, right? And we don't want the kids to feel shame in regards to that. So I always encourage anybody that's going through a separation, if it's a cordial separation where you can have a conversation with your partner, it'll be great to have both of you, both parties there to address the kids together. Of course, if the parties are not cordial, then finding an opportunity where you guys can figure out how you want to break this news down to the children, so that way your messaging can remain consistent throughout. And then that way you can express that to the kids on your own, and finding a way to do this in a comfortable space. Don't take the kids to their favorite spot like a McDonald's or ice cream shop to tell them this news, because now you're going to make that spot feel terrible. They're going to remember that spot as being the worst place that they've been to. Take them, somewhere where it could be in the home, it could be in the room, have like, blankets and whatnots, just to make that environment a little bit more comfortable. So that way they can receive that news and you can be there for them.
And I think leveraging community, right? Because I mean, not to say that you need to have everybody in the business, right? But I mean, maybe after you have that initial conversation, if it's something that can be done, or maybe it's not something that can be done in a safe manner, but if there is another person who can join in, so that even the kids know that, if you don't feel comfortable talking to me, you can always go and talk to so and so, right? And allowing them to also know that, conversations about what they're feeling can be ongoing, right? You may not necessarily feel anything right now. You might be like, okay, I knew it was coming. You and dad used to argue all the time. Well, mom, I just want you to be happy. And then you might find a couple months from now that, like, actually I'm feeling something different. Or you might find that now I'm, older, 20, 21, I'm thinking about having my first relationship. And I am having thoughts about, my parents' relationship and how that went. And so I think, a part of this is, some of the ways that we can really kind of support our kids is just allowing for there to be a flexibility and kind of a dynamic approach to this.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
How can parents avoid the parentified child trap?
Mhm.
Because I know that we're talking about how we tell our children, but how do we do that in a safe way for our kids rather than causing them to feel like they now become the parent? And
Mm.
it's really tricky. But how do those that are navigating divorce, keep those respectful boundaries and keep that safe emotional distance from their child while still being open and honest and showing them that it's okay to feel your feelings and emotions? Like, how do they navigate that?
That is an excellent question. And it's also a hard question because what it means, it calls for parents to have a certain degree of emotional intelligence. And historically, we're not taught, right? Feelings, emotions. I always laugh that I'm one of the only people in my family who literally talk about feelings and emotion on an everyday basis. But the reality is being able to, going back to Jen Lewis, what she was saying, like kids see and feel more than we give them credit to. It is making the space for the children to be able to say, okay, you've recognized mommy and daddy are fighting and we're arguing a lot. Well, yes, we have been. And what this means is that we're not getting along because of something we're going through. Yes,
Mm,
you're impacted by it, but it's not, you're not the cause of it. Being able to have that certain degree as parents of emotional intelligence to hold that emotional space for the child, well, then asking questions that go along with, when mommy and daddy or mommy and daddy are fighting, what are you feeling at the time? Right? Because kids are, they're more intelligent and they're feeling more deeply than a lot of parents give them credit for. So allowing them to understand, and they may come out and say, every time you fight, I hide in a closet, or I'm hiding under the bed, or I'm putting the music up very loud. They're finding ways to cope because they don't understand what is happening and what is going on. So it's first and foremost important to understand yourself, what is going on, and not allowing that child to be the one to take care of your emotions, but really being the parent, the adult in this case, to take care of that child's emotions and your emotions at the same time. And again, shameless plug for all of us, if that is something that you're struggling with, don't be ashamed of it, but come and get the support. Because I truly believe also, I am a child of divorced parents. I truly, truly believe that parents need to be equipped emotionally with those supports to be able to then navigate the grief they're going through in that, but also to help their children to navigate the grief that they're going through. It's a completely different level of grief, but also being able to hold that. And a lot of parents aren't able to hold that because they're going through so much on their own, right? So it's a very there's a strategy there and it can be complicated.
I think it's a
absolutely.
sign, like, I
Mm,
think, like, it's not a sign of weakness that you're not able to navigate that,
Mhm.
That's not what that, means by any capacity. And I think, in addition to the therapeutic support, to leveraging other supports, books about divorce, books that speak about, in an age appropriate way, so that kids can also take their time, read the book, come back and ask questions. And I'm a strong proponent of nonverbal ways of communication as well, right? I think sometimes we think that expressing emotion is only what you can speak about it. But, I think, certain things like, here's a journal. This is something that we can go back and forth with. No matter what you put in here, there's no judgment, there's no shame. Put it in there, draw the picture, whatever it is that you need to be able to express yourself for me, right?
mm,
Sometimes be able to lower that bar that somehow the kids need to figure out all the language that they may have. They may know that they're coping, okay, put on the music, but that deeper part that like knows that there's something there, they may not necessarily have the parameters around that to be able to express it. So I think also being able to, and as you're navigating it too, manage your feelings, your emotions, having some nonverbal ways to be able to communicate feelings, thoughts, perspectives, all of that stuff, I think could be something that could be introduced as well.
Yep.
Yes. And I
And
mm,
Jen
would
said in
add
the
too.
chat,
So I think right now it's also important to separate in terms of like siblings, like how many kids, if you do have children, are in the home. And if you are the oldest, you may feel a level of responsibility to jump in to support your parent. And it's up to the parent to ensure that, you know, because of course when you're going through a separation you may have extra responsibilities, right, where you're taking on probably more work to financially compensate, or you're responsible for picking up the kids more often and drop offs and whatnots. So at times you may be requesting extra support from your child and saying, hey, like, can you wash the dishes? And it might seem small at first, but then we start adding on more things to that person's plate, to that child's plate, and then now they're getting into a role of, I have to also support and take care of my siblings, or even just take care of myself. So as parents, we got to be mindful of what it is that we're putting onto our children in the moment, so that they can also process through their own moments of grief, but also knowing that they don't have to play the role of a rescuer.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Mhm.
And I just noticed that Jen said in the chat that yes, an age appropriate language. Therapists who work with kids can be an incredible asset. And I just wanted to say, like, absolutely find your kids people that they can talk to. Sometimes it's going to be people within your village, right? Just like Shanique was saying earlier, right? It could be an aunt,
Mhm.
cousin, grandma, whoever is a green light person. That's great.
Yeah.
But sometimes the kids don't want to go and talk to those people, right?
Yeah.
And so finding a therapist that they can talk to and everything is confidential is actually
Mhm.
going to be paramount, right? Because then it goes to what was said before, which Leanne said, would it impact your kids' future relationships, right? Knowing that what Shanique said before, divorce is like a trauma, right?
Mm.
When you look at the ACE scores, it actually is listed as one of the things that is a trauma,
Yeah.
right? So
Mhm.
the impact long term on relationships, right? Because again, this is an attachment injury, right? I would then advocate for you to then find someone for your child to talk to, right? If you have several kids, right? Sometimes you can get pro bono. Sometimes you can go with, like, especially in Ontario here, a qualifying therapist who can take you on for a cheaper rate. But find somebody who's a child therapist who specializes in children's therapy that you can take your child to, and they can unpack
Mhm.
it out. They can play it out with the sand trays and all of the things, right? And they can get it off their chest what's going on. And it's not to say that it won't impact their future relationships. When you allow them to sit with a therapist and work through it and process it, when they actually are at the age that they're then recognizing, okay, I'm going to go into relationships now, they're aware of how it might be impacting their relationships. They're able to talk about it and process through it, as opposed to then having this being a blind spot in their lives.
And I think you start to
Absolutely.
normalize the idea of getting help. I have,
Mhm.
a client and I'm always amazed by this young man, early 20s, and his focus is on being a good partner, right? Taking some of his
Mhm.
experiences that he's had before and how can he ensure that, as he's approaching dating in his early 20s, that he's not bringing in some of those unhealthy familial patterns. And I'm sitting there amazed at this young man that you're choosing to come to therapy for this, but it was a bit of a muscle that was already developed, in advance, that this is a good resource. As I'm now
Mhm.
later on in life, I can come back to this. And so, I'm in alignment with Shar around that as well, that I think it is important to start to show your children different avenues of support early.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. And I throw another thing out there. Um, Kids as power trips. We see this so often in when relationships end, where either they're being triangulated into the conflict. So what we mean by that is, go tell your father that, XYZ. Oh, I'm not talking to your mother, so you tell her this and that. And I'm saying it in a basic way, but you know what I mean, where they're pulled into the conflict and they're forced to take on a role in the conflict. People, this impacts your child.
Yes, and don't do
All right, you guys tell them because,
it.
go on with it. Hmm.
Yeah. You know what? As you're saying, that brings up personal memories for me. Yeah, that's why I said don't do it. Don't do it. And the reality is, put my therapist hat back on, but don't do it, because what it does, it goes back into the parentification of that child, where the child is now being the messenger back and forth of adult conversation. And the child may not have the wherewithal to know of, like, okay, what's going on? What's happening? What's the basis of this? But I'm just a messenger back and forth. And with being the messenger, they're also holding the emotions that are coming with that message
Yes.
that is being said and received from one person, then delivered to another person, and then having to back and forth, right? So it's not only the verbal um, context of the words of the message, but it's also the emotions and emotionality. And then the child not really being able to understand what is going on. What do I do with this? I don't have anyone to process or understand it with. So I'm just going to figure it out on my own, kind of thing, right? So yeah, it's when we talk about the parentification and then these messages, we have to understand how they're going hand in hand and how they're going tandem. And what happens is then it does impact how the child is able to understand the divorce that's happening between the parents, but also what's happening is they're putting themselves in the middle of the divorce that is taking place. And so then they're holding on to some of that responsibility for that divorce, and that becomes really harmful to this child. So then it has an impact for the future, and then how they go in to navigate relationships and all of that. So that's why I said don't do it.
I think too, the child's nervous system.
Yeah.
Having to go back and forth, this child's nervous system is consistently activated all the time, anticipating what's next. Should I say this like this to mom, or should I say like this to dad? Like, and I think when we think about it just from a neurobiological perspective, having a nervous system that does not have an opportunity to adequately shut down, reset, um, it lends itself to other issues, right? Maybe not just, in the moment, but maybe later on down the line as well. And so, I think this is where bringing in that additional, more professional support will be able to identify and recognize those pieces.
Now, with that said, okay, there are times when we have to have those difficult conversations when maybe, a parent is choosing not to be a parent anymore. And we know that happens more often than we would like to admit, right? What can some women do if that's the case for them? It's not all the while now. Let me make that clear. There are some really good fathers out there. Big up yourself if you're one of those fathers and you know you're one of those big up yourself and you're listening. All right. We'll big you up, right? But there are some that just are absentees, or they're supposed to spend the weekend with their kids, then they don't show up. And there's some moms that are navigating this with their kids, and they might be listening. It's like, okay, I don't want to you know cause my child to be a parentified child, but how do I explain it to them in a way that doesn't triangulate them or pull them into the conflict, but yet they're being forced to be in the conflict? Asking all the tough questions today. All
That's a
right.
hard one because at this sometimes in walking with clients who are going through that divorce separation piece, we do have to recognize that sometimes that caregiving role becomes, and I hate to use this word, but this is sometimes how it feels, a prison, right? Because you don't get the luxury of escaping the way that perhaps when you were in the relationship, it just kind of went a little bit, it was a little bit more fluid, right? Like I could pop out, dad is home, he can watch the kids. It's different when I have to be like, hey, can you take them on Friday? And you're like, no, I don't want to, or no, that's, I'll only take them for one day. I'm not going to take them for two. Right. And it becomes a negotiation around something that was so fluid while it was in the relationship. And that becomes very confining for the woman. And even if, for example, there is maybe a better communication related to the kids, inadvertently, as a result of divorce, somebody does become a primary parent, right? Even in joint custody situations, there's still a primary who oftentimes will take on more of that load. And so, and I'm going to leave that open to the ones who actually have kids. I wonder if that is a conversation that comes up for the kids, is a conversation to have with the kids even, right? As opposed to if it is a matter of the kids wondering where the parent might be, addressing that question, or, how comes I don't see my parent, maybe, attending to that question, as opposed to maybe looping them into the other dynamics that are happening, if that was what you were asking, Felicia.
I agree with what you just said. It really is about the child coming to you, and then how do you hold space for what they're going through in the moment, right? So you as a parent, you could be noticing a whole lot, right? But not actually saying that to your child. But when your child comes and they're like, I was supposed to see dad, and then he didn't happened. At that point, you do have to actually answer your child, and
Yes.
being responsible about how you answer that really then focuses in on listening to your child, really hearing them, right? Allowing them to just share whatever feelings come up, and being curious about what's happening within them, right? So the questions, that's really where you're going to actually like just lock in. You're going to lock in on all of the questions, right? So yes, you're absolutely right, is where you begin, right? And what made you bring what made that come to mind for you, right? And listening to what they're saying, because then you're actually dealing with the emotions that are coming up for your child in the moment, and not just like guessing, because you might guess wrong,
Mhm.
right? And then really asking them, okay, how does that feel that happened, right? And helping them to navigate the whole aspect of being able to identify their feelings, right? It's
Mm.
hard, but your job really in that moment is to just be regulated as much as possible and hold space for their experience.
Mm.
I want to add
That's
to that,
mhm.
and not making an excuse of where the other parent is. And I know that is like a go-to for a lot of people. It's like, well, maybe work went late or something. Don't make that excuse. Just say, I know that you're hurt. You were excited to go to the park or have this play date that you had planned for a bit. Let's talk about how upset you are by that or how sad you are, right? I think that making excuses, I think especially for women too, right? We try to like put these things where it looks really good, and it's like trying to make that excuse helps that facade. But what it actually does, it creates more mistrust and distrust,
Hmm.
right? And the thing is, then it makes you as that parent who's making the excuse complicit
Yeah.
in the person not showing up. So I think we do have to be really, really careful in that, and not take that accountability, not take that responsibility. And I know it's done because this little person that you're responsible for is hurting, but
Mhm.
recognizing that the hurt is an emotion that can be spoken about, and it's okay to speak about the hurt.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Tell them it
And
sucks. Tell them,
mhm.
right? It sucks,
It
right?
does.
And I'm sorry. And a hug, it can go a long way.
Absolutely. And be prepared for the range of emotions, right? Some kids might just say, I don't know, and they might clam up. Give them time, right? Create the safe space. There's some that will become Hulk and get angry,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's also, anger gets a bad rap, right? It's information, right? Give space for it. Obviously, if they're destroying things like the TV and thing, you have to slow them down. You be like, listen, we can't afford one next TV, so stop this madness right now.
That was the last show.
Right? But be like, okay, you're angry. Let's talk. When you've calmed down,
Mhm.
let's talk about it.
Yeah.
Right? We'll give them some space to feel the anger, and then say, okay, now let's give some words to it. Right? And just help them to navigate that. And if it's hard for you to do it, then again, we circle back. You know, talk to a professional. Right? Whether it's through family therapy or if it's for their own individual therapy. Because again, we're talking about grief, and grief looks different, right? It's still grief. This just has a different face,
Mm-hmm.
right? And don't rush them through the grief. Come on, no, you got to get over this now. No, no, my sister. No, my brother. No. Okay? Let them grieve at their own pace, just like you're grieving at your own pace. They don't want to put on a smile today. That's okay.
Mhm.
Let them feel their feelings and give yourself the permission to feel your feelings too. You don't have to pretend, you don't have to put on a happy face if you're feeling sad,
Mhm.
right? Give yourselves time to grieve the relationship, and everybody will grieve it in their own way. That's all
Mhm.
right. That's my TED talk. All
Yeah.
right.
Well said.
Well, you also look at the inverse of that, though. So
Yeah.
the parent who becomes the fun parent.
Mm,
Yep.
Yeah. Well, the other one has to be the responsible parent.
Yep.
Mhm.
mm. And the financial piece that is attached to that. If you don't have McDonald's money, I'm tired of Ronald McDonald taking people's money. Okay? He's rich enough.
So, listen, Tim Hortons is just as bad. Tim take money, Wendy take money, everybody taking
Eh, all of them,
all of them.
right?
That definitely does, that lends into things to be mindful of, right? Because,
Mm-hmm.
that has a different way of weaponizing the children in this process as well. Um,
Right?
and even if it's meant to be something that is harmless or whatnot, because perhaps maybe one parent actually does have McDonald's money, right? Let's just be honest, and the other parent doesn't. But I think it's something to, consider in terms of as you are raising these two, as you're raising this human being, right? And they're going to be growing in two different environments. There needs to be some form of cohesion, right? Like, and we're talking McDonald's money, but what about certain things like access to social media or phone usage? All of these things are at one parent's house. Maybe there's some strict rules around that. The other parent's house, there's nothing. You can do whatever you want. And then it becomes this, oh, I'd rather be at this parent's house than that parent's house. And it's not that, you're necessarily speaking any ill regard towards that next parent, but your actions are making it so that there is this, imbalance between the child's experience in both. And obviously, you can parent your kids the way that you wish to, but I think it is important that there is a cohesiveness because if not, one parent does become a good parent and the other parent becomes a bad parent, even if you're not saying anything.
Mhm.
And I also think too is that sometimes we may not have that cohesion in both households. And at some point, you may have to just let your child know, hey, well, you know what? There's two different household. This is how the other person is going to parent, and that's okay. They're going to do their thing. But for here, where you're at, this is what I'm going to set, right? So that way they have that expectation to know that it is going to look a little different because it's not always going to be just as linear. It's going to fluctuate no matter what, even in regards to the days that you're going to be there with bedtime routine. One
Mhm.
parent might be okay with you staying up at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., and the other parent is like, hey, you got to be in bed by 8 o'clock. But we
Mhm.
can't really switch that other parent's routine because they may be coming home late from work and they want to spend more time with their child, right? So it we have to find a way to be okay with what those expectations look like at that person's house, depending if there's safety concerns, then that's a different issue. But if there's no safety concerns, then we can, balance it out.
Mhm.
Mm,
We've been talking about
Mm.
therapy for the kids. I think it's important in this because to be able to even have that conversation, you do need to have a level of emotional intelligence, have processed your feelings. You're not coming at because you're still upset with so and so, and you know what I mean? So I think even for, the individuals in it as well, is, this is an ongoing process for you as well. There might be things along the journey. You could be divorced for 20 years and then something triggers
mm,
right? And so, recognizing that your own healing is nonlinear, you may need to tap into support, and it may not necessarily. I think sometimes, folks think that therapy needs to be this long drawn out. I'm in therapy for years, right? I actually don't necessarily think that's healthy, right? But I do think maintenance is very important, right? So maybe at the beginning you saw therapy, a little bit more actively because you were going through it, but don't, be afraid to kind of chip back into it if you need to. If there are moments like this where I'm like, how do I have this conversation? Don't feel like you need to navigate that on your own.
Mhm.
mhm,
And I'll say this, like, going to therapy for co-parenting, right?
Mhm.
Therapy does not have to, I have clients who have said this, like, can we come to couples therapy, but we don't want to get back together,
Mhm.
right? Like therapy can absolutely be used for co-parenting support and it's
Absolutely.
actually recommended. right? To be like, okay, now we're in a different dynamic. How are we going to co-parent? Our goal is our child. How do we co-parent together? Right. So like look at therapy not only as, you're working to get back together the relationship, but also if you need help separating, if you need help co-parenting, you could utilize therapy for a whole plethora of different things that might not be that focus on the radar. But if you need support in your wellness, you can go to therapy for that.
Wow, this is a really juicy topic, Love Bay, if you want a part 2, email Love Bay or call in and we'll do a part 2. But you have to talk to us. If we don't hear from you, we won't do a part 2. Okay? We'll do another topic. But I think that there is so much that we could talk about this topic tonight, and I think that it was beautiful and powerful. So, ladies, if you can drop a, a 30-second gem for the Love Bay family as we close tonight, what would that gem be?
I would say take your time. Going back to my initial point when I started, this is not, no two divorces, no two separations are the same. Even if this is a multiple, like this is not your first divorce, right? It's not going to be the same as maybe one that you've had before a separation. And so I think giving yourself the time and the space necessary to be able to really go through your process, I think your future self deserves that.
Absolutely.
And I will say, it's okay to lean on other people. It's okay to lean on your village, because this process, there's no timeline for it in terms of when you're going to feel completely healed. And you may not feel completely healed because it's a grief, right? It's going to come in waves. But I think it's really important to lean on your community, lean on your friends, your family members, ask for help if you feel like you're financially in a bind. Talk with those people and tell them and let them know, like, hey, this is where I'm at. Lean into your community at church if you have a church community. So any supports that can really uplift you and help you go through this process.
And I'll jump in and say that, this process, divorce, it can be very isolating because of the shame and the stigma. So there may be a want to isolate yourself further, but don't do it. Don't do it. It's actually not beneficial for you in the long run, for your children in the long run, for your wellness in the long run. Find individuals who get it, who've either been there before and they've navigated it, whether well or not well. Reach out to therapy, reach out to community. There are different centers who talk about divorce more regularly. Those can be places where you can go, but do not isolate yourself. It's not fair to you, right? And a lot of times what happens is you end up isolating and not being fair to you because you're looking at everyone else's wellness.
Yeah. And I think that what I would say is put on your oxygen mask first, right? At the end of the day, you can't take care of anybody else if you are done for, right? So really put on your oxygen mask, figure out what that looks like for you, right? Find someone safe to talk to that you can actually just allow all of the feelings, all of the frustrations, all of the anger, all of the confusion to come out, right? Allow yourself to grieve, allow yourself to feel the process, right? And work through it, right? Which is why I said find someone to do it with. You can't do it by yourself, right? I also think that it's super important, though, that you're also providing that support for your kids too, because it's a loss for them. It's a loss for you, but it's a loss for them. So giving them their own person that they can work this through with is super important, right? Because in some ways, you're not going to be able to be there for all of the things that they're going through because just you can't, right? So having people, whether it's community, whether it's their own therapist around, so that your kids can really process whatever they're thinking and feeling and whatever is coming up, and what they're being triggered by, what they're being activated by, allow them to work it through. And the last thought here is just around the mommy guilt might come up. It is what it is. right?
Mm,
It is what it is. It's there. Allow yourself to just notice it, but
Mm.
don't allow it to overwhelm you, right? Allow yourself to just recognize this is part of the process and it's okay.
mm. And there you have it, Love Bay family. As we come to the end of tonight's conversation, I want to leave you with this. The end of a marriage can be the end of a chapter without being the end of your story. And grief doesn't mean you made the wrong decision. Missing someone doesn't necessarily mean you should return. Feeling relief doesn't mean the relationship meant nothing. And starting again doesn't require you to erase the life you had before. Sometimes healing is learning how to hold the complexity of all of it: the love, the disappointment, the memories, the anger, the lessons, the grief, and eventually the possibility. You may not have chosen this chapter. You may not yet recognize the person you're becoming within it, but there can still be life after the life you originally planned. And maybe starting again isn't about becoming who you were before the marriage or before the divorce. Maybe it's about discovering who you are now. Thank you, thank you, thank you again to our incredible Real Talk panel tonight. Charlene, Natasha, Shanique, and Anansa, for sharing your heart, your wisdom, so much vulnerability, compassion, and insight. And thank you to our Love Bay family for joining us and for making space for conversations that aren't always easy, but are deeply important. And next week on She Speaks on the Mental Health Hour, we're having a conversation about something many high performing women know all too well. What happens when you're building, leading, achieving, and your body is asking something different of you? I'll be joined by Sophia Jacob for Leadership Truths Unveiled: The Silent Strain, Fibroids, Pain, and High Performing Women. Sophia is an award winning entrepreneur, event planner, marketing strategist, community organizer, and the president of Sophia J Events. For more than a decade, she has been building businesses, creating networks, developing strategic partnerships, and advocating for greater representation in leadership. She is also the founder of the Canadian Women of Color Leadership Network, a grassroots organization working to increase the representation of women of color and non binary people in boards, C suites, and other influential leadership positions. Her community leadership has earned her numerous recognitions, including a Women's Entrepreneurship Award, and so much more. You got to tune in next week to find out more. But next week, we're going beyond the accolades. Sophia joins me for an honest and deeply personal conversation about what it has meant to build, lead, and show up for her community, while also navigating fibroids, chronic pain, and the physical and emotional demands of living with an often unseen health condition. We'll talk about the pressure many high performing women experience to keep going even when their bodies are struggling, the relationship between pain, stress, leadership, and mental health, and the difficult question many women eventually have to confront: what happens when our ability to push through becomes the very thing that keeps us from listening to what our bodies need? This is a conversation about leadership, womanhood, health, ambition, and what sustainable success actually looks like when we stop treating our well being as the price we have to pay for achievement. So that's next Tuesday on She Speaks, right here on the Mental Health Hour. You definitely don't want to miss this one. So until then, Love Bay, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and remember, your healing matters, your story matters, your voice matters, and you never have to carry it alone. Good night and peace out.